Hello and welcome to Short Tales. For today's episode, I am delighted to be joined by my friend and author, Gabriel Bergmoser. Welcome, Gab.
Thanks for having me, Damo.
It's a genuine pleasure. I've been really looking forward to this chat. Quick bit of background for the listeners before we dive in. So you and I obviously met at uni doing a master's together, master's of screenwriting. We've pretty much been sort of crawling through the writing trenches ever since, trying to scrape together a living. Which brings us to our topic. So Gab, what's our topic for today?
Our topic is writing as a job.
Yeah. Love this. So what sort of, obviously there's lots of things with it. We always love talking writing together. There's so many different facets we sort of love chewing on. What was it about this one that made you go, I think I want to talk about this?
Well, look, it was one of those things where when you sort of asked if I wanted to come onto the podcast and have a chat, I was like, well, hell yeah, I do. But I started thinking about topics. And I was like, what do we talk about? What can we talk about that's interesting? What do we have, I guess, a perspective on that might be unique or might be fresh or might be valuable?
Yeah.
And of course, from our many, many chats on these topics, we can talk structure and theme and character and everything until the cows come home and, go on for ages.
Yeah.
But I think that you and I are in very similar positions in that we both now make a living completely in our field. And that already puts us in the minority and in a very, very lucky minority. Beyond that, it also... We've both been in a very similar position where we've used a lot of different means of income to make it work as opposed to just kind of having like one set job. And I do think that there is a misconception sometimes when it comes to the idea of making a living as a writer that, it's like having one massive book deal that might, keep food on the table.
Yeah.
It might be like writing on one TV show. It might be this, or it might be this, or it might be this.
Yeah.
And that's probably how I used to think about it. But in reality, like for as long as I've been making any money from creative pursuits at all, it's been coming from a lot of different angles. And it took a while to kind of like figure that out and master that and work out how to run that in order to actually make a sustainable income on it.
Yeah.
And for many years there, it was an income. It was a very good one.
Right.
But I guess I always kind of go back to when we were at VCA and we got taught a huge amount about, what to say in meetings, what to do in meetings, how to handle this, how to pitch an idea, how to structure your story, how to hone in on the theme, all of those things that are hugely, hugely valuable. But the things that we never really heard a lot about were A, how to break into the industry,
for sure,
and B, how to actually sustain a career as a writer.
Yeah.
And I think that the reason for that is largely because everybody's path is so different and there isn't really one clear set answer. It's not like other industries where, you get qualified and then you go out there and you have an entry-level job and then you're in.
Exactly,
It's extremely different to that.
That's it. And obviously I teach now at uni screenwriting as well. So often I'll have a student come up and be like, okay, so cool. Once this course is done, you're like, what do I do next? And I kind of like, well, that's up to you. Ultimately, like I can't tell you, just go to this place, put your name on the list and they'll give you,
And what's so funny about it, I think, is the fact that when we left VCA, I remember both of us, I think we were, I still remember this, we were on a train heading back after drinks, after some... I don't know if it was after like our graduation or something. Anyway, we were both talking about the fact that we just didn't know what to do next.
Yes,
we were just kind of like, what comes now? And we were bemoaning the fact that we weren't given any guidance as to like, all right, you finished your course, you finished your master's, you have literally done the highest screenwriting qualification in the country that you can do.
Right.
Now what? How do we get a job? How do we move forward? And it was a real point of, I guess, frustration for me at the time. That we hadn't been given that guidance about how to actually break into the industry.
Right.
And for a few years there, that remained the case until I guess I kind of like started to find my foothold in the industry and work out, well, the reason for that is that everybody's path is so different.
Yes.
And whether you come at it through, the classic path of doing note-taking in TV writers' rooms until you eventually get writing work, whether it's the classic thing of just sending out, query letters to agent after agent after agent after agent until you sell your book, whether it's, coming at it through teaching or podcasting or whatever else. And I think in both of our cases, it's kind of in a mix of all of those things.
That's it.
I just thought it could be really interesting and really valuable for your listeners, and particularly for listeners who are interested in writing as a career and as a vocation. And I'm really sorry to those who aren't, because this is probably going to be incredibly tedious to you, to actually delve into that and actually just be honest about it and lift the curtain and look at the nitty gritty of like, how do you make writing your job?
Yeah. I love that. And I agree. There's like you even said, you've already sort of listed a few different paths you can take. And even I think what made that time so frustrating for both of us is that the people we'd sort of asked for advice didn't even give us didn't sort of point out those different paths or sort of give us the first few footsteps to take. It was literally just like, I don't know, like, you're like, we got to like give us something. And like, ultimately there's like, it's always going to be on the individual to figure that out for themselves. Obviously different aspects, different jobs are going to work better for different personality types and all that sort of stuff. And obviously different opportunities are just going to come up for different people. But just sort of knowing that there is like a pretty wide net you can cast in terms of those first steps. So I guess what might be good is if we kind of even give a bit of like, when you sort of said you started to find your footholds, what were those early footholds that started to work for you?
Yeah, so it's funny because I look at it now and I kind of go, there's a very, very clear A to B to C to D.
Yeah,
kind of
feels,
you know, kind of growth into the industry. But the reality is that at the time it didn't feel that way. Like, you know, for most of the years until I guess my breakthrough year, which I kind of think of as 2019.
Sure.
I really felt like I was going in circles. Like I really felt like I was getting nowhere. And then when I kind of had the moment where I broke through and I was like, oh, cool, I've figured out my place in the industry. I've figured out like how to actually sustain a career here.
Right.
I looked back and I was like, oh yeah, like everything very clearly led from one thing to another.
Yeah.
And so, look, for me, it was kind of a mix of things that initially happened simultaneously. So I was writing from a very, very young age, you know, from basically being a kid to being a teenager and everything. I wrote all through high school. I spent, you know, my first few years of adulthood kind of writing novel after novel after novel and sort of, you know, emailing every agent in the country and being rejected by every agent in the country. And then, you know, when that didn't work, I went to publishers and, you know, that didn't work and on I went. And, you know, I mean, that's kind of, at the time I had this belief that I was missing something, right? Or that there was some hugely important key or approach or way of looking at this that I didn't have. That there was some secret I was lacking, you know? And I think that's a really common thing with young writers where, you know, it is one of those things where, you can go and you can study and you can learn and everything, but you always kind of wonder what sets apart the authors who are out there and are selling heaps of books and are doing well and are just, you know, published full stop from the rest of us who are just sitting here, you know, trying to write things, trying to put our ideas on the page and not making a hell of a lot of headway. And one thing that was said to me years and years later, like after we were at VCA, when I was kind of in a position where I was really frustrated and lost and just kind of starting to feel like maybe I wasn't getting anywhere, was that I reached out to this author who I'd met in high school who had been a friend of a friend who'd read a couple of my early manuscripts and given me a lot of feedback and advice. And I kind of reached out to him very frustrated and I was like, what do I need to do? Like, what do I need to do?
Give me that secret, buddy. I know it's out there.
And he just said to me, you're doing everything right. And that blew me away because I was like, well, what, like, that's either really positive or really negative because if I'm doing everything right, then maybe I just suck. But like, and maybe, you know, it's me that's the problem and I'm taking all the right steps. But when he said that, I think that was the beginning of me realizing that there wasn't really this big secret to it. Like it really is just a war of attrition. So, you know, for me, it was most of my 20s, cold calling, cold emailing, doing all of that, and then kind of getting nowhere. I self-published a book in 2012, which, you know, sold maybe 30 copies and, you know, was not a particularly auspicious achievement. I started producing theatre in 2013, like writing and producing plays. And the reason for that was not because I had this burning passion for theatre. The reason was because I was just like, I was at the point where I've been writing for so long and I wasn't finding audiences for my work. And because, you know, of course I wasn't because my work wasn't very good. And, you know, you will find that when you're a young writer and you write, you know, big rambling manuscripts and you give them to your friends, you know, they're not necessarily going to sit there and read them cover to cover. Most of them just say, oh yeah, cool, I'll see if I can get around to it. And they just won't. Whereas theatre, you know, an hour of somebody's time to come and see a play is a little bit of an easier commitment. So I guess I started doing that and learned a huge amount of lessons from that. But, you know, theatre didn't inherently progress me. It just sort of taught me a huge amount. Same time as I was doing that, I was at VCA studying and I started doing the podcast Movie Maintenance that we both did for a few years as well.
Yes, we did.
And it's funny, you know, because movie maintenance is an interesting one for me now because I think that was really the beginning of me being a working writer.
I love that.
Or me being able to consider myself a working writer. And I have, I guess, complicated feelings about that podcast now because I'm so grateful for the opportunities that it gave me. You know, without movie maintenance, Boone Shepherd wouldn't have gotten published, you know, my first book. Boone Shepherd kind of only got published because I had the audience for movie maintenance, I had the backing of movie maintenance, and that meant that when a friend of mine who wanted to start a publishing house came to me, she saw a potential benefit to it selling books, which it ultimately did. Not in like enormous numbers, but you know, enough to make it a worthwhile endeavor.
But again, we're talking those early footholds. So
absolutely. And at the time, you know, every foothold like that didn't blow up and change my life and make me like, you know, an overnight Stephen King felt like a failure. But you look back now and you kind of go, actually, no, that sort of did really help and that did really
help. Exactly. Especially when you're looking at that person you were at that time when you're like, why can't I find an audience? Why is this so difficult? What am I doing wrong? Blah, blah, blah. Then all of a sudden you've written a book and it's found an audience. It's not the biggest audience ever, but you're like, fuck, I need to stop and actually, and this is what so many writers who are like, you know, they're looking at the tip of the mountain and they've just sort of taken the first few steps, but it's huge that you're on the mountain at all.
Exactly. You know? And that's it. And, you know, I think that what Movie Maintenance gave both of us was an audience. Just hit the nail on the head because prior to that, I didn't have an audience. I had friends who might come to some of my plays. I had really loyal friends who might have read my self-published book or read, the manuscripts I'd sent them or whatever. But generally speaking, I didn't have people who liked my work and came to it, not because they knew me, but because they liked my work.
Right, yes.
And Movie Maintenance gave us that. And then from Movie Maintenance, that springboarded Boone Shepherd. Without Movie Maintenance, I wouldn't have written The Hunted, which ended up being, my first big novel in 2019. Basically the book that single-handedly changed my life. And, I remember kind of getting to the end of Movie Maintenance when that show finished and being really lost and really kind of just not knowing what came next, because the other thing was that some of the time I was on Movie Maintenance was the time I kind of began to actually make a living as a writer. And that came from a mix of things. That came from me freelancing. That came from me teaching creative writing at Melbourne Young Writers Studio. That came from the small amount of money we got from Movie Maintenance. That came from the royalties I got from my books and my plays, which weren't very much, but were there. None of those things by itself was a viable income. But altogether, it was really, really valuable. And I think the linchpin for all of that was Movie Maintenance, because that let me... This is going to sound so hackneyed, but it's true. It kind of let me believe in myself because, you got a lot of affirmation from audience, from your audiences and from your listeners who would say, hey, that was great. That didn't work, and it was such a learning curve. And it's one of those things now where, I'm so immensely grateful that we had that opportunity and that, we got the audience that we got. What I'm not really as proud of that show anymore, because I think that there's just I look back at it and I'm just like, oh my God, there were just so many things where I'm just like, did I have to say that? Did I have to act that way? Did I have to carry on that way? Because I think for so long I didn't realize anyone was listening.
That's it. You also the experience is just I am sitting around a table chatting with my mates about movies. Something I do all the time.
And you don't filter yourself and you don't think about it. And then suddenly it's one small thing that you say or one angry tirade you go on about a film that happens to be a film that means a lot to people. People start losing their minds about. And you go, oh my God, this is surreal to say, but what I'm saying actually does kind of matter to people. That taught me a huge amount about audience, about perception, about how people perceive you and your work. And, early on in Movie Maintenance, I remember getting criticism for saying something or for doing a movie pitch that was bad or whatever, and getting really defensive and angry about it. But as it went on, it kind of balanced out, because I was like, well, hang on, how can I get angry at being criticized when the point of this podcast is criticism. And I'm sitting here saying, well, those Hollywood bigwigs should be able to take it. Well, if I want to consider myself professional in any way, I've got to be able to take it as well and realize that some people won't like what I do.
Which is such a fucking great lesson.
So important.
And a good level to have that lesson. I do think probably obviously some other creatives out there might get that level of success, get higher up that mountain, and then really not have had to face any kind of criticism before. And it can really crush them. So Movie Maintenance gave us so much. Definitely, same as you, I think that belief in self and
absolutely.
People hearing your idea for a story and going, yeah, I'd watch that. You're like, really? That's awesome.
And the thing is, we leveraged it because I realize that for anyone listening who doesn't know Movie Maintenance, the idea was that we fixed bad movies and we pitched alternate versions of movies or franchises that weren't working. And that springboarded to quite a few things for us. We did Movie Maintenance Presents, so we were doing radio dramas and audio dramas on the side that were original and that were ours. We did books that kind of leveraged off the back of it that we either self-published or whatever, and then sold to listeners and everything. And it did form an audience for our individual writing that was hugely valuable, and there was some income coming from it as well. So it kind of feels like in some ways the years I was on that podcast were like a crash course for for being a writer and thinking about how to present, thinking about how to come across, thinking about the people listening to the show, as anybody who's spent any time on the internet know, if they love something, they'll be very, voracious about telling you. If they hate something, they'll be very voracious about telling you. And there's kind of no escape from it one way or another. And so you just kind of have to
You never get any comments that are just 3 stars, yeah, you guys are doing all right. I don't mind.
No, never. It was really one or the other. And, that was
such a roller coaster to go on.
It's insane, right? And you do just eventually kind of get to the point where you realize, okay, cool, I just have to be able to... the criticism of my work isn't criticism of me.
Yes, good call. And love that.
Once you figure that out, it's a lot easier to take it. I had this thing recently where this book reviewer on social media and everything, who's got quite a big following and who has been hugely supportive of my work and was one of the earliest advocates of The Hunted and everything. Reviewed one of my more recent books and was just look, The Hunted was amazing. I love The Hunted. This just sucked. This was boring. This wasn't very good. This just wasn't working for me. And I reckon the me of like 5 years ago would have been like, fuck you, man. How dare you say that? You know, you've betrayed me. You've let me down. Now it's just like, oh, well, I really hope she likes the next one.
Yeah.
You
But
know?
like there's even like a sort of an appreciation that like, cool, you're taking each piece of work for what it is.
Exactly.
And like, that's ultimately what you do want. You don't want to like sort of even like the listeners from Movie Maintenance who are saying really positive things. Like part of that learning curve is to go, that's awesome. I'm so glad they're so positive. Don't let it go to my head. Don't let it make me think, oh, great, I'll just do the same thing for the next one, or you know, take the easier path because they love me, whatever. And the same sort of thing as this. Every piece of work needs to prove itself and stand up on its own two legs.
Yeah,
and like,
absolutely.
I think having supporters who are, or critics or anyone who's going to give you that honest feedback of like, yeah, here's where I thought it was, you know, lacking, whatever. And then ultimately, it's still just their personal opinion.
And of course, there was one great bit of advice I was given by our old lecturer at BCA, Ben Michael, who said to me, if you believe all your good reviews, you have to believe all the bad ones as well.
Right, yeah.
And I think for my time on Movie Maintenance, one of my biggest problems was that I did the opposite of that. Like every time somebody told me, you're amazing, you're a genius, you're incredible, I took that on board and I let that bolster my self-belief in my opinion and everything, my opinion of my own work and everything. But anybody who told me, you're an idiot, you're an asshole, how dare you say that, you know, we don't like your work. Or anybody who was just like, I just didn't think it was very good. I'd be like, screw that person, I don't want to hear that. And consequently, it was like, I realized that my whole sense of self-worth was actually incredibly tied up in that podcast. And so when it ended, like, I was just like, I'm not getting this constant stream of affirmation of my work. And that kind of actually forced me to this really, I've never spoken about this before actually, but it kind of forced me to this really weird place of being like, I have to actually work out who I am outside of the guy who's on that popular podcast and has an audience and everything. And that forced me to realize for the first time in my life, and again, it's one of the amazing and, you know, one of the many, many valuable lessons I took from that show was it was the first time I had to be like, I'm not my work. I'm not that podcast. I'm not defined by what I did in that podcast. I've actually got to be, you know, a complete, stable, solid, functioning human being outside of this. And that's made it easier for me to, figuratively speaking, when it comes to like my current work, go home at the end of it. And to kind of switch off and just say, you know what, like in case of The Hunted or The Inheritance or True Color, White Lie or whatever, some people will love them, some people will hate them. A lot of people will just be in the middle of it. And none of that is a reflection on the human being I am.
Definitely not.
Or my capacity to do the work.
Yeah.
It's just a reflection on that individual thing.
Exactly. And like another thing that we sort of, I think we collectively figured out as we're doing Movie Maintenance and me going forward into sort of more critic work as well, has been like, everyone's allowed to have their own opinion.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because at no point does it either diminish or increase what the work actually is. The work will always just be what it is. And then people's opinions, positive or negative, is exactly that. It's just their opinion.
And, you know, that was one of the craziest things about doing that show was, you know, around time I was doing, one of the other jobs I was doing simultaneous to Movie Maintenance and freelancing and everything else was that I was doing criticism. I was doing online criticism of movies and TV shows. And doing my creative work, my critical work, and then something like Movie Maintenance, which met both in the middle, kind of gave me a huge amount of perspective on criticism and on creativity. And like I had a friend who did a play recently and the play was not very well received. And this friend, like I spoke on the phone to them and they were like going on a huge tirade about how this reviewer was an asshole and this person was a dickhead and this had it in for them and whatever and stuff. And I'm just kind of like, I think you need to take a bit of a step back and be like, you know, if you know that you put everything you had into that work, if you know that you did the best job you possibly could, then you can be at peace with whatever the response is. Because the response likely is that the person just didn't speak to the person for one reason or another. But if you really have thought through every possible angle of what you're trying to do with this piece, then you kind of have nothing to worry about.
You've already achieved what you sorted to achieve.
And I do kind of believe that, you know, bad reviews hurt the most when you agree with them.
And interesting.
That's a belief I have. A lot of people kind of push back on that. But I don't know. I don't have any resentment towards critics now because I know that, like, I know from having been a critic, you know, you don't come at criticism because you hate something. You come at criticism because you love something and you want to be able to engage with it and work out why it's working, why it's not working, and everything. And I actually do think in a lot of cases the onus is on the creatives to recognize that and be like, just because somebody doesn't like my work doesn't mean they're an asshole. It just means they don't like my work. You know, do I think I'm an asshole because I don't like the newest Star Wars movie or whatever?
Exactly right.
Like, how is that, you know, does that make me a piece of shit for kind of being critical of one thing, but anyone who's critical of me is a bad person? Like, that's like, and it's so funny how few creatives, like, actually look at that dichotomy, if that makes sense. And I really do think for the purposes of professionalism, to bring it back to the topic which we wandered quite far from, that critical thinking, that being able to separate yourself from the work and to realize, you're doing a job and it's going to be for some people, it's not going to be for other people. You've got to be okay with that. You've got to have that separation.
Yeah. So something you also mentioned was sort of, which I want to sort of dig into a bit more, because I think it's arguably one of the more valuable things we'll hopefully say in this podcast, is that thing about how you sort of cast a wide net. You're doing lots of different things all at once to make a living as a writer. So when was it for you that you kind of figured out, oh shit, I can't just be writing novels and trying to get them published, or writing scripts and trying to get them out there. Like, I need to get money in my pocket.
Yeah.
Like, when did you sort of go, oh no, I need to do all these things sort of simultaneously?
Look, I don't think there was ever one crystallizing moment where that became clear for me. I think that was a gradual, slow realization. And I think what happened basically for me was that it was around the start of 2017 where I got not a massive, but by my standards at the time, a pretty big commission job.
Right.
And it was one of my first ever paid writing gigs. It kind of came out of nowhere.
Yeah.
And I still had a day job at the time, but I just remember having that like lump sum of money that kind of gave me like a 2-week buffer, basically, of not having to have anything else come in.
Yeah.
And I just had this moment of being like, okay, so I'm doing movie maintenance. I'm getting a little bit of money from that. I'm doing freelancing work. I was using Upwork at the time, and I was doing the most like degrading freelance jobs, dude. I was writing Amish erotica and like billionaire romances, and I've spoken about this in other things before, but you know, like I one of the ones that made me feel the dirtiest was like this guy's like screenplay that was basically just propaganda for Bitcoin. I novelized. Like it was miserably depressing stuff. But honestly, in my mind, I was just like, well, it's either this or I'm a bartender, you know? So
right.
Like, and in my mind, I was like, look, at least this is practice, right?
Exactly. Yes.
And it taught me something that I will come back to just about writing as a job, which, you know, I think there's a couple of different layers to that statement that I want to dig into a little bit later. But for me, it was the mix of all of those things, and then of course the plays and the criticism and the books and everything. And I kind of looked at it and I did some maths, and I was like, I think I can do this.
That's
like,
exciting.
I think I can do this. I know I have to tighten my belt a little bit.
Sure.
But I just think if I make sure that I'm doing as much freelance work as possible, if I make sure that I'm podcasting as much as possible, if I make sure that I'm taking every opportunity that comes my way, and I'm working to sell books, I'm working to get more plays out there, and I'm doing as much teaching as possible because I was doing creative writing tutoring at the time, then every stream of income I have will be writing related.
Love that.
And I will no longer have some set day job that I have to rely on to eat.
Yeah.
Now, here's the thing. I made that choice. I did that, and it worked. Yeah. It worked for a while. There was a point towards the end of that year where it was a mutual friend of ours, actually, Simon Howe, and I'm sure Simon wouldn't mind me saying this, but Simon is like a very in-demand and very successful illustrator.
Hell yeah, yeah.
And Simon and I had this conversation where he spoke about him hitting a similar point, where he basically was like, I think I'm just going to do illustration work now. And he was freelancing, and he was doing this, and he was doing that, and he was doing that. But then it got to a point where the money wasn't coming in. For one reason or another, the money wasn't coming in. He wasn't getting jobs. Things had dried up. And he was kind of like, okay, I have to go back to, I have to potentially go back to my day job. I have to go back to, I think it was like waiting tables or something.
Right.
And he went back to his old restaurant. He was like, I know that they'll let me back if I want to go back. And he went there and he did one shift, and he was like, I'm not qualified anymore. Like, I don't remember how to hold a tray. I don't remember how to serve food. I don't know how to use the new systems. Like, I don't know how to do any of this anymore. And it hit him then that he's like, oh no, I'm an illustrator now.
Right. I've thrown my hat into that ring.
And I have to make my money doing that.
Yeah.
And that was this weird case where he sort of said that, and that really stuck with me. And then a few months later, movie maintenance ended, and that was like, what I didn't realize had been such a major stream of income for me suddenly went. And that's the dangerous thing about freelance, about work as a writer and having to rely on all these different things, is that if one falls through, you'll suddenly find that's like a wheel coming off a car, and you're like, I'm suddenly like, I don't know if I'm going to eat this week. I don't know.
Right. You've kind of got to put a new wheel on while the car's still running.
And figure out a way to do it, because you then realize I've got all these other responsibilities. Like, it's not a full-time job, but if I want to successfully, if I want to keep this balance going of freelancing and teaching and doing plays and doing books and whatever, then I actually don't have the time anymore to go and wait tables or work in a bar or whatever. It's like either I go and do that and get rid of all the progress I've made in actually achieving my dream, or I just have to like somehow tighten the belt and make it work for me somehow. And, that was one of those things where the money we made for that podcast was not much, but when it's that with all these other things, it's important. And that was like a real like slap in the face moment where I was like, I've got to find something to make up for this. And so,
it still needs to be within that writing world. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so, I was like, all right, what are my qualifications? Like, that was kind of what I had to start from was, all right, what are my qualifications? And basically, I took a couple of opportunities that came my way about like, basically doing creative writing workshops in schools around the country. So I started doing that. And I just started freelancing more and just taking on even more degrading freelance jobs. And that was kind of just like how I kept myself afloat until I got the book deal for The Hunted.
Yeah, lovely.
But it really was that thing of being like, I'm not qualified to do anything else anymore.
Right.
I've been, only doing writing work for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
If I try to get a job in a bar, why would they hire me? I haven't worked in a bar for, even like before I, quit my day job, I was in retail. Like I hadn't worked in a bar for 4 years at that point. I'd worked in retail in 2 years. Nobody was going to hire me again to do those things. So I had to kind of find a way to make up for it with writing. And that's sometimes the unglamorous reality of this industry.
Yeah, and I love that too, because it is kind of like there's both a benefit and a cost to sort of getting to that point where you're like, I'm betting it all. That sounds like more grandiose than it actually is. It's sort of like you said, it was this sort of growing realization. It's the fact that you did have these multiple streams of income, everything like that. Because for me, it was sort of similar. Obviously, I worked in labs and that sort of stuff, science stuff, and then I moved from that into doing like more just working for universities. And I knew I wanted to, like at the start, I was working full time after our course. And I knew I wanted more time just to work on my own stuff. I knew that if I didn't have some time just working on my own stuff, well, then how would it ever be something I could potentially sell one day? So great. I got a different job that was like 4 days a week. Cool. I've got 1 day a week for writing. And then eventually I'm like, all right, there's another position opening. I'm going to go down to 3 days a week. So now I've got 2 days for writing. But then while I was doing those 3 days a week, I was doing similar stuff to you. I took up some work, obviously, at the Melbourne Young Writers Studio teaching. Obviously, we're doing the podcast and, a few other little bits and pieces to sort of, not even necessarily to help my income, because I don't know that they did that much.
Yeah.
But just to sort of get me out in that world. Because again, like you said, it's always the time part is the tricky part where obviously, yes, hell yeah, you need money. But time is also so crucial when it comes to writing or any work related. So as soon as you're putting time into something that gives you money, it's time you're not putting into the writing stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And so finally, same sort of thing as you. I was still teaching, I was still podcasting, and then I got an opportunity to lecture at the uni. And that was sort of the tipping point for me, kicking off those 3 days a week. And I kind of knew that it was a big decision to make. It was a big leap. Luckily, I've got an excellent partner, Holly, who was more than willing for me to do so and sort of help support me, which definitely that meant I had a safety net. But I kind of knew that taking this step, that as much as like I kind of convinced myself, oh, well, look, if it doesn't work out, I'll do it for a year and then I can go back, But part of me at the back of my head thought, well, no, what's the point of doing that? Like, it does feel like, again, if we use the mountain metaphor, if I've climbed halfway up the mountain, I don't have to climb back down again.
There's also like, is it a fallacy of sunk cost? Like,
right, exactly, yeah.
Am I going to fall off a cliff partway up the mountain?
And that's it. And so this is where like, there's the benefit to like, holy shit, I'm making my living as a writer, freelancer, and all the sort of, it's both exciting and interesting and all that sort of stuff, but it's like fucking dangerous in the sense of,
hugely,
like you said, you could lose a wheel at any point. You might lose all your wheels. And this is where like diversifying, which is really what we're talking about, is so useful because you might lose a stream, but hopefully it's not like if you just had one stream, well, then that's it. You only had two, that's half of it gone.
Exactly.
So the more you have, especially in those early days, but no, sorry, not even in those early days. Fuck that. Like still today, like obviously, as you go forth with your career, unless you become Stephen King, you still probably want a couple of different streams. One, it's more interesting as well. But,
totally.
But two, it just means that, cool, if one of them does fall off for a bit, you're still good to go.
And look, the thing of it is as well that like, I mean, obviously the position I'm in now is very, very different to the one I was in back, when we were at uni or doing the podcast or whatever. And like, I'm doing really well with my books and everything. I'm getting quite a bit of screenwriting work. But honestly, the stakes are higher, sure. And it looks a lot more glamorous from the outside. But I don't think what I'm doing now is really any different to what I was doing 4 years ago in terms of just doing as many different jobs as possible.
Yeah.
Like, here's my theory. Like, when I talk about writing as a job, I genuinely believe that a lot of writers don't think it's a job.
Right.
I think that a lot of writers genuinely believe that it's some mythical vocation that makes them special.
Yeah.
And God, I dislike that way of thinking. Like, I saw this article, and I know this is a complicated issue, and I don't want to wade too far into it because it's like, I know that there are a lot of counter arguments, and if that was the topic of the podcast, sure, it might be different, but it's more an attitude thing that annoys me. I saw this article in The Age recently that was basically advocating for why the government should pay artists a living wage.
Right.
And it was basically saying, this is why, the government should be paying artists this much per week to like do their art and everything and blah, blah, blah. And I don't think that way at all.
No.
I looked at it and I'm like, no, you need to be making things that people want to pay for. Like, I mean, yeah, it's like, to me, it's like if you earn your dues, like whether it's freelancing, whether it's podcasting, whether it's doing whatever, and then you want to, do the classic one for them, one for me thing, or you get to the point where you're like, a Scorsese or a Jane Campion, and you're such a like shit hot auteur that you can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
Then you have the right to make things that are purely self-expressionistic and all of that because you're going to make money from it because you've got a following anyway.
Yeah.
But to me, it just seems incredibly arrogance. It seems. I could be so wrong on this. There could be so many ways in which I'm not thinking about it in the broadest way possible.
Yep.
But the point at which I tipped and started to become successful was the point at which I was like, how do I sell my skills?
Right.
You have to think of it the same way that you would think of like if you were a plumber or a waiter or anything.
Yeah.
Being like, what skill set do I have and how do I sell that?
Yeah, I love that.
And to me, the start of the start was movie maintenance, where I was like, okay, cool, I understand story and I understand criticism and I love film.
Yeah.
All of those things kind of come together in me doing this podcast.
Beautiful.
But beyond that, when it came to freelancing, I was like, okay, cool. I know how to write. I can write decent enough prose. I can write fast.
Yeah.
And I can write relatively polished stuff fairly quickly. I can sell that to people who want ghost-written things.
Yes.
Some people who want copy-written. I can do all of that.
Yeah.
And I understood that, I would have to do a couple of jobs that were like as bad as like 3,000 words for $30 type things.
Yeah.
So that I could get the rating up.
Yes.
So that I could start getting the bigger jobs, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah, great.
But because I guess like there were so many disappointments in those years that I couldn't really have like this ballooning ego about my ability as a writer because there was always something around every other corner to disabuse me of that notion.
Yes.
Yeah. So basically I was like, all right, cool. This is a job. This is a skill set that I have, and I have to somehow apply that and be like, what can I sell to the clients?
Yeah.
Like, HarperCollins are basically a client. They hire me to write a book, and I write a book. It's the same whether it's Vertigo or Stampede or Beyond or any of the companies I've worked for. And it's like even the other day I was invited to join the writers' room for this new TV show, and that's like I'm flattered that I'm even asked, and I love that.
Yeah.
But my thought on that isn't like, oh my god, I'm so incredible. My thought's like, oh sweet, I got another job. Because the thing is, I'm ultimately still a freelancer. Like that's actually how it works at the end of it. I joke all the time that I don't have a job because I'm ultimately still a freelancer, and I only keep a roof over my head and food on the table as long as I keep getting work, and as long as I keep being able to give my clients what they want.
Right.
And if I can slip some so HarperCollins want like an action-packed pulpy adventure novel or, action thriller novel, I can write that. It becomes more valuable to me if I can slip some, depth and self-expression.
Put a bit of a character study in there and all the rest.
Of course, that's what I try to do.
Yeah.
But ultimately, I know that the readers who I have, and of course, the moment you have an audience, you also have an obligation to them as well. So I know that, my audience and my readership want a certain thing from my books. And I saw that firsthand when I wrote The Hunted, and The Hunted did really well.
Yeah.
And I followed up with True Color, which was this, introspective, coming of age dramedy story about a teenage boy's struggles.
Yeah.
Couldn't be more different to like, the explosions and gunshots and decapitations and everything of The Hunted. And of course, I had all these people being like to me, hey, when's the next book coming out? When's the next book coming out? I'm like, here it is, True Color of Little White Lie. And of course, it didn't do nearly as well. And none of those people responded because it wasn't what they wanted from me. It wasn't what they were paying me for.
Yeah.
And that's fair enough. It's disappointing because I love True Color and I still hope it kind of grows and finds an audience and everything.
Finds its own audience,
It's exactly in its own terms. But I can't expect the people who are paying me for one thing to be happy when I give them something else that is kind of a more self-indulgent project for me, you know?
Yep.
And so when I read articles like that, I kind of go, well, you're looking at it all wrong. Think about it in a more like, broader business sense where it's like, how can I sell what I do?
Yep.
How can I sell what I do to build an audience? And then once I've done that, start doing the more self-expressionistic experimental things.
Yeah.
And that's it. I really do think your first step to finding any success as a writer is don't think it's this mythical vocation. Don't think that you're special. Don't think that you're any better than, anybody else, any other industry, anyone else out there. You're not.
Yeah.
You're not. You have a different skill set. And if you can apply that skill set well for a client who will pay you, then you will do okay. But you are never, you ultimately, unless you are Stephen King or whoever, you are a freelancer.
Right.
Just accept it. You are a freelancer. You have a skill set. You're doing a job. It's a job. It doesn't make you special.
That's it. It's not this big romantic thing. It's a grubby little. It's a grubby little
job. We know
job.
that because we've been in the trenches. You said it at the start. We've been through the. We've waded through the absolute shit of writing. We know it's not glamorous. You tell me that it's. You tell me that it's fucking glamorous when you're writing Amish erotica and somebody's fucking Bitcoin fantasy.
Right.
Like it's not.
That burgeoning industry of Bitcoin erotica.
Well, that was probably the logical endpoint had I kept doing those kids.
But But yeah, your point is great. Like, and I sort of one of the notes that which you basically mentioned, is sort of saying yes to things and taking opportunities, not because it's like, oh, this is going to fulfill my artistic desires, because it's going to allow you to be a working writer. And I think like the idea that, you know, the place you are now, where obviously you're getting books published, you're working on TV shows and movies and this sort of stuff, even though the work you're doing is different, the job itself isn't different from that point when you're writing Amish erotica.
And that's exactly it. And that's what I want. If anyone takes anything away from this podcast, there's more money.
Everyone should be writing Amish erotica. That's the one takeaway.
I recommend it. It's a path. It's not a great path, but it's not a fun path, but it's a path.
It's a path.
Yeah. Look, I don't know. I think that's kind of the crux of it, and just being like, don't think you're better than anything.
Yeah.
Don't think you're better than anything. Don't think you're above certain jobs, because if you're doing the job, and this is my ultimate thing, you know, I was talking to a director friend of mine the other day about him being in a writer's room with basically some writers who clearly thought they were above the material.
Right.
And to which I'm like, well, if you're doing the job, you're clearly not above it.
Yeah, because guess what? You're here, mate.
You're here. It's like, I'm sorry, but like, if you have taken a job, whether it's out of necessity or whether it's out of growing your career or whether it's out of anything, by definition, you are not above it because you have to do it.
Right.
So shut up and do it well. You know?
Do it as good as you can. Yeah.
And that's it. Just don't and I've known actors who, like, the amount of times I've heard anecdotes about actors who are good and they're well trained and they've done everything, and then they refuse to do commercials.
Right.
Because they're like, no, I should be the leading man right away.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, good luck, mate, because you know, you've got to do those small things and work your way up. It's the same with writers who think they're going to sell, you know, the next major bestseller tomorrow, and they don't think they have to write Amish erotica or teach or whatever else.
Well, whatever it is, exactly. And that's the thing. It's like, I think the sooner you sort of embrace that side of it, of like, well, one, it's like anything, like, especially for art, it's like, well, you're not good enough yet, actually. Like, and I think the sooner you sort of say that to yourself, and even if it's like you've got to apply the Malcolm Gladwell, 10,000 hours rule. Go, all right, have I done 10,000 hours? Definitely not. That's a fuck ton of hours. All right, I better start doing some stuff. Can I get paid somewhere along the line for those 10,000 hours? Even if it is, you know, $30 for 3,000 words? Yeah, okay, great. That's good. That means I'm actually getting a few dollars while I'm getting my way up to that 10,000 hours or whatever level you set for yourself.
And that's kind of how I thought about my freelancing shit, was that I was just kind of like, okay, so I freelance for a bit. I'm erotica, and basically I'm like, it's all practice. Like, it's not wasted. It's not like it's not demeaning. It's demoralizing, but it's not demeaning. It's like, I'm not above it because I'm doing it. So shut up.
There it is. Yeah.
But you know, I'm making some money doing it. I'm doing all that, and I'm learning. I'm getting better, and I'm improving all along the way. And there's another contentious thing that I know that there are valid arguments against it. I'm just expressing my opinion on it. I'm neither right nor wrong. It's just my opinion. Coming back to the early thing about criticism. But it's like whenever I see those little comics that you always see in the arts industry, where it's like, oh, we're not going to pay you in money. We're going to pay you in exposure. And the artist says something like, oh, my rent's 500 exposures. How good's that? And I'm like, when you're starting out, it's not offensive to work for exposure.
Right.
It's really not. Like, I didn't get my first paid writing gig until I was, like 26, I want to say, or somewhere thereabouts.
Right.
Like, before that, you know, I wrote for youth theatres, I did independent theatre stuff. You know, I did heaps of stuff for free because I wasn't good enough to be paid yet.
Right.
And, you know, to me, it's like, well, cool. I spent most of my early 20s doing work for free, and it wasn't good work, and that's fine. It didn't have to be paid for.
Yeah.
And whereas, you know, then you fast forward to even just a couple of years ago, somebody reached out and asked me to write a play for them, and they pulled out the old exposure card, and they were like, oh, you know, we can't pay, we can give you heaps of exposure. And that's a point where I can just say, without any arrogance, but just with full awareness of where I am, not to them, but my thought is, well, I'm above that now. I don't have to do that now. Like, you know, I get paid, I can sell my work, and I just said very polite, said to them, oh, look, I'm sorry, I'm a bit too busy, hope you find someone.
Yeah, great.
And that's fine. I wasn't offended by that offer, because, you know, that will be a great offer for some up-and-coming writer who needs to learn.
That's it, yeah.
And that's fine. And it's ultimately just up to you to get to the point where you're confident enough to just say to those jobs, well, no, I don't have to do that anymore.
Right. But in those early days, like, yeah, you might have to do some stuff because it's an opportunity to learn. It's an opportunity to get feedback. It's an opportunity to interact with people and have your stuff out there and ultimately, yes, get exposure. Because good, now you're one step further up that mountain.
And also, you know, I mean, don't discount how important perception is as well. You know, I had I remember being at this event for HarperCollins a couple of years ago, and one of the other authors came up to me and was like, oh, I had to look at your website, and you know, it's like I had to pause reading all your credits because you know there are so many of of them.
Yeah.
And it's funny because I'm like, yeah, on paper it looks like I've done a huge amount.
Right.
But like a lot of it was just like, you know, community or youth theatre projects or things like that I got paid nothing for.
Yeah.
And like there was a point where like HarperCollins, I think, included some of those things in like one of the bios in one of my books.
Right.
And I was like, yeah, you might want to take that out though, because like I put that in my bio assuming nobody knows what it is.
Right.
And it's just like I think I said that like I'd won some award or something.
Right.
Which I had, but it was like a like rural, like, you know, local award for like, you know, the Mansfield Fair like short story award, which of course I abbreviated to the MF whatever. Yeah,
very nice.
It wasn't exactly that. It was something along those lines. You know?
And
there's a few things like that where it's like, you know, you choose how you frame, like or, you know, the classic one is that everybody always says that like, it's put in all my bios. It's like, you know, he was nominated for the Kenneth Branagh Award. No, I was long listed for the Kenneth Branagh Award.
Right, yeah.
But technically that's a nomination.
Yeah, nominated sounds better.
Know,
yeah.
Perception's really important.
Yeah.
And you know, you can like, or like, you know, I think I've put in a lot of my bios like quotes from like the time The Age reviewed one of my plays and said something really nice. Yeah. And of course I always put that quote in things. I'm just like, oh, The Age said this thing about my play. It was a 2-star review. But you know, but of course you still frame it that way.
Yeah.
Because like, and so when you're like, if you're on your way up and you're looking at like writers who seem really impressive and you're looking at all their credits being like, oh my God, have they done all of this?
Yeah.
Like, you know,
that's how they've done
a little bit closer because a lot of it's probably bullshit, and that's fine. You've got to bullshit because, like, the more that you come across as somebody, it really is that fake it till you make it thing. The more you come across as somebody who like is this kind of showy professional, then you know the more people are likely to take you seriously.
Yeah,
just be aware that if you are the emperor with no clothes, they'll find out very quickly.
Sure.
So you've got to know that you've got the skills and the ability and the passion
to back it up. Yeah. Well, that brings me nicely to another topic I was hoping to talk about, which is sort of the hustling. Yeah. You have to be a hustler. And like, again, like I said, for my students who sort of say, oh, Damo, what do I do next? And when I first got asked that when I was teaching, I was like, oh, I guess this is what I wanted as a student, right? Like you mentioned earlier, we wanted someone to show us the path, tell us what to do. I was so dead keen to work, and I know that these students are too. They're like, I'm so ready to do this, I just don't know where to go, right? So I kind of felt this big urge to be able to tell them exactly what to do, and I obviously couldn't. That's an impossible thing. And so kind of like, you know, thinking about it later, I'm like, well, the thing I want to tell them is like, one, it's up to you in terms of how much are you going to get out there and do all the stuff we've been talking about. But ultimately, the real word for it is hustle.
Yeah.
You got to go out there and hustle. And maybe the hustling is, you know, doing those upwards jobs, or maybe it is doing something for exposure or whatever, or maybe it is going into reviewing or going to teaching, whatever, like it's just about doing anything you can kind of think of that's moving towards the mountain. There's this Neil Gaiman quote. I'm using mountain analogies a lot in this episode, but there's this great Neil Gaiman quote where for him coming up in his career, he talked about every time he sort of had a decision of, do I want to take this job or not? It was like, does it get me closer to the mountain? Yeah. The mountain being his ideal sort of working environment, which obviously, he's peaked that mountain. I think we can fairly confidently say that. Yeah.
He's doing all right, young Neil.
He's doing okay. I see big things in his future. And so it's something that I've taken with me ever since. And even like for me and my wife, even if it's just our personal goals and nothing to do with my writing goals, we still sort of stop and say, does it move us closer towards the mountain? And so like ultimately in those early days, the mountain is so far away, almost anything you say yes to is going to get you that little bit closer. And so that's when you got to kind of say yes to everything. You got to hustle. You got to put yourself out there. You got to put on your own plays. You've got to make your own web series. You've got to start a website and put some stories on there, like whatever it is to move you slightly closer to that mountain. And then the closer you get, well, that's when you can start to like, the hustle becomes slightly different because it now is a thing of me taking this job. Is it actually getting me close to the mountain, or is it my sort of taking sideways steps?
Yeah.
And so I think kind of what we're getting around is like those early days, there's lots and lots of different things that can get you close to the mountain because at the moment, you're nowhere near the fucking mountain. Unfortunately, it's on the horizon. So any step is going to bring you closer in that direction. And that's where, you know, in the early days, you do have to say yes to things that aren't the ideal thing, but you also got to recognize you're not near the mountain yet. And in this analogy, that means you're not talented enough to be standing on top of that mountain yet. Yeah. And that's just a hard reality every creative has to face.
And I love that you say that because I really do think that like there is this misunderstanding, I think. The term believe in yourself. There is a misunderstanding about that term. Yeah. Because people say that and it sounds like a Hallmark card thing. It sounds like, you know, believe in yourself, and you hear that and you roll your eyes. Like, you know, and I still do it when people like, you know, when people comment on things that I post being like, you need to believe in yourself and everything. And I'm like, oh, shut up.
Yeah.
However, you do have to. And the reason but what I want to stress is that I don't think people quite understand how pathologically insane believing in yourself actually is. Because believing in yourself to succeed as a writer, that's like, you have to do that.
Yeah.
But you also have to believe in yourself when like every little bit of evidence is telling you that you are barking up the wrong tree.
Right.
When people aren't taking you seriously, when you're not getting jobs, when you're getting passed over, when you're not being looked at, when people are laughing in your face, when all of which has happened to me, when you're getting terrible reviews, when you're getting all of this stuff. And if you are somehow able to maintain belief that you can do this through all of that shit.
Right.
You are a pathologically insane human being, but you kind of have to be, you know?
Yeah, reality needs to take a little step to the side while I pursue this.
You know, it's like if you can couple that with a healthy sense of, you know, realism about yourself and about being like, all right, that didn't work. How do I do that better? How do I improve? How do I learn from that? You know, and look, for all of us, like, you need your ego to be punctured. You know, you really, really need your ego to be punctured, like, a lot.
Yeah.
Because, you know, if that doesnn't happen, it gets, you'll get out of control. And,
sure. Yeah.
You know, it's funny, I remember my, the week that changed my life when The Hunt had sold to HarperCollins and the film rights sold and everything. I remember my agent calling me and she was just like telling me about everything. And I was like, you know, and I was really blown away. And I was like going to dinner with some friends and everything. And she was like, she called me outside of work hours and she was like, sorry, I know it's like at night and everything. I just want to make sure you're okay. And I was like, yeah, I'm okay. And she's like, yeah, you just seem very calm. Right. And I was like, well, it's just because I won't believe it until it's happened. Like, because I've just been through that much, like, that many, like, near misses project-wise or career-wise that I'm like, this is amazing and I'm excited. But I also know how quickly anything can fall apart in a second because I've seen it. And my sense of self-belief, you know, I believe that I can do it. But I also know that, like, just because I'm in a good place now doesn't mean that there aren't going to be more failures and more, you know, things where I fall short and more disappointments. Like, it happened to me, you know, there's things I was talking about before off air about, like, a recent project I was working on really hard and really believed in and put a huge amount of work into. And then, like, for the most arbitrary of reasons, it fell apart at the last minute. And that happens.
That happens, yeah, that's
you know? I think in a weird way, things like that are good because they kind of just remind you that as well as things can be going for you, you're not this incredible, unimpeachable genius. You're just somebody with a skill set that you've worked to develop, and sometimes that skill set's going to be enough, and other times it's not going to be enough, and sometimes you'll fall short, and that's going to keep happening for the rest of your life, and that's okay. Just do better next time.
That's it. And like, I think even like to follow on in that, believing in yourself is like, it's not I believe I'm the greatest thing out there. It's I believe I can be better.
Yeah.
So when you get that criticism, you're like, thank you. Now I'm going to take a little step closer to being better.
And how
like,
do I improve on
I
that?
believe in the potential of me, but I'm also aware that I'm not there yet. Yeah. And like being able to hold that dichotomy in place is very powerful. It's really going to allow you to keep the positive mentality you need to keep hustling and keep working and keep saying yes to things and keep doing all the shit we're talking about, while still also believing one day this is all going to culminate into a career, which, like, you know, ultimately it does. And it might not even be that crystallized ideal king of the mountain career that we're talking about, where it's like publishers or TV execs or whatever throwing all the money they can at me to make whatever my little brain desires. But it is going to be, I'm making a living off of writing or writing adjacent work or whatever it might be. Like, I have the potential to achieve that and hopefully more. But yeah, having that belief in yourself while also tampering it with, but I'm not there yet because I'm not there. Like, it's ultimately like, if you were, you would be there, and that's great. And I hope you, like, for all my students, I kind of generally want them all to outstrip me. I want all their careers to be bigger and better than mine, because they've all got the potential, but the ones that are going to do it are the ones that are going to be able to have that realization, do the hustling that's required, take those hits that are required, and still have that ultimate belief that, cool, if I keep working and keep improving, that's what's going to get me up the mountain, rather than someone handing it to me on a silver platter.
Exactly. And you're just kind of like, you know, being willing to just do the shit-kicking jobs and to do everything and just not think you're above anything. You know, I think that's kind of, if you can have that mindset at the start, you know, believing that you can be better, believing that you are capable of achieving this, while being able to know that you're not there yet, being humble enough to know that you're not there yet, and being willing to do the work to get there. I mean, like, I've spoken before in, like, blogs and interviews and everything about this one of the most pivotal turning points in my career was a review of an early play of mine that tore it to absolute shreds. You know, famously, like, you know, or famously insofar as anyone who knows about my career knows about this review, because, you know, and it's funny because people still say, oh, you got to get over it. And I'm like, no, I'm glad that I never got over it, because, like, it was the most kind of humiliating thing when, you know, I did that play in this early point in my life where everybody just kind of was like, oh, you know, you're doing, like, do this, believe in you, like, blah, 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 and everything. But nobody was actually holding me to account or criticizing me.
And it was also that stage in your career where it's like, because you are new in this arena, like, putting on a play is huge. It's like, that's like, holy crap, you put on a play. It doesn't even matter if it's good or bad. Yeah. That means you're standing out and you're doing really well and you've already achieved something, which you definitely fucking have. Yeah. But the next step...
And that's the thing. It's like, in and of itself, you're right. Doing the play was an impressive thing. And then the play comes out, it gets like torn apart by this big review, like really like absolutely torn apart. I'd never had that experience before. Right. I read the review, I was like, I don't know how to handle this. And it was that thing where it was like, it hurt because it was true. And it made a lot of really good points that I'd overlooked. Mm-hmm. And it hit me then. I was like, all right, well, I want to be seen as a professional. And up until now, I've been just happy to put things out there and just assume that everyone will like it because they're impressed that I'm doing it for exactly that reason.
They're looking at it through the amateur writer lens, which is not a bad thing. That's not derogatory. Not no. We're all amateurs at one point. And then, but if you want to play with the big boys...
Which is what happened with this review. This guy comes in, he treats it professionally, he tears it to shreds on that level. Mm-hmm. And I was like, and I had to look at it and I had to kind of critically be like, okay, well, that hasn't worked for me. And then, you know, I went back to the drawing board, I reworked, I figured out my approach, I did all of that. And then I think 2 years later... I had another play go on and that same reviewer came to see it. And I remember seeing his name come up and I had sleepless nights. I was like, oh, no. God, I think I've gotten better, but I've only got my own word for that. Like, I don't know what's going to happen. And I was so scared. And he came in, he reviewed the play and he gave it a really glowing review.
Awesome.
And then I got positive reviews like my next few plays from that same guy. Yeah. And then when The Hunted got acquired, I saw somebody who I knew shared it, and this guy commented being like, oh yeah, I've seen a lot of his plays, he just gets better and better every time. And I'm like, see, now that to me, and you know, a lot of people when that first review came out were just like, oh, it's just one person's opinion. I was like, yeah, but it's a bit more than that when you agree with it, you know, when it's actually kind of struck a chord with you and you kind of go, you know what, like that was right, and I'd actually value it because this person was honest, and this person proved there that, you know, this person was not willing to accept mediocrity, and
that's it. Like, they're almost holding you to the stand, like they're holding you to the standard you really are trying to go for. So they're holding to your standard. They're actually kind of saying you can do better.
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing, because it's kind of like, all right, cool, you know, if you want to be the little fish in the big fish in the little pond. You know, if you want to do that, and if you want to kind of just sort of, you know, like, and I've had plenty of those opportunities in my career, and I've sometimes to my detriment, I've turned away from them. You know, like I've had cases where I came up in the youth theatre scene before anything else, and, you know, I was doing regional youth theatre productions, I was writing plays for them, and I was getting like a lot of affirmation from the cast members and everything, from the parents who came and saw them and stuff, and I loved all of that, but I was just kind of like, well, I want to get bigger, you know, I want more. And I made choices to leave those communities that were safe and that were accepting and go into like bigger ponds where the fish were not as kind. No. And, you know, and that standard of work wasn't good enough. And it was like, okay, well, I have to shape up or ship out. You know, I have to get better. Yeah. If I want to put my work out there and invite critics to see it and be lauded as this incredible playwright, then I've got to be this incredible playwright. The only way to do that is to, you know, listen to the criticism and try to improve and try to get better. And just to kind of realize that, like, this is the thing, you know, a lot of creatives hate critics, but you actually need them. Because they hold you to account. And again, it's just kind of like, if you stop viewing being a creative as this mythical thing where it's like the critic should come in and see your incredible spiritual genius playing out on the stage or in the book or whatever, stop looking at it that way and just be like, okay, you know, have I done a good job? Have I not done a good job? This is my job. Am I meeting my requirements? Am I hitting the standards I need to be hitting? And, you know, criticism is always subjective, and, you know, you can always read it and say, I don't actually agree with that. But I argue you can only really do that if you've read it and thought about it and fully considered it. But ultimately, you know, don't view them as your enemies. View them as your friends. You know,
exactly
they
right.
kind of are.
That's it. And I think like that kind of brings us nicely to the sort of maybe our last point that I was hoping to talk about, which is, you know, putting yourself outside your comfort zone.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like I remember having this listed into my mind where after that, because I'm definitely an introvert, I'm sort of more on that end of the scale. I'm sort of an extroverted introvert where I can happily, fairly uncomfortably, you know, be social and enjoy that sort of stuff, but it does ultimately drain me, sort of thing. And then I also do get very nervous when I'm going outside my comfort zone. So moving from like literally working in labs, which is like a very cushy comfort zone, you're literally just with the same group of people, literally in this building in the same place every day, wearing the same clothes every day. And then moving into freelance, which is obviously that's pretty outside my comfort zone because there's no security. You're constantly having to sort of job interview always, right? Like obviously job interviews are really stressful. As a freelancer, you're kind of constantly needing to prove yourself to a new person every other day, you know? And so I remember having this one where I was literally just going in for a note-taking job, and I was on the train and I was so nervous because it was my first note-taking job with a proper production company, and to be honest, I had no idea what to do as a note taker because no one had really told me. So I literally, and I don't think I did a very good job either. But I remember on that train ride in, me feeling all these feelings and going, oh, I'm going to have to get used to this. This is going to become the norm, right?
Yeah, man.
And it was like such a eye-opening revelation. And it's like, it wasn't a comfortable realization, but it was one that I was like really glad I had, because that continues to be the case to this day. Like, I had a meeting last week, my guts were churning before this meeting, like, it went great and that's good. But like, that doesn't necessarily go away. But by acknowledging it and just be willing to put yourself outside your comfort zone, recognize it's outside your comfort zone, and then go, good, I must be doing something right. I'm outside my comfort zone.
If you have that churning guts feeling and that kind of that terror before you go into something, that means you're progressing. That means you're not stagnating. It means you're not sitting in the same place being like, all right, cool, this works.
Right.
It's like, I had a similar thing recently where, something came up that I was like, huge opportunity.
Yeah.
But I was terrified. I almost didn't do it. I'm quite happy. Like, I'm doing well. I'm writing my books. I'm doing a bit of TV work. It's fine. I'm kind of getting along fine and everything. But I knew that this was something that like could, really, really take me to the next level. And it was the fact that I was scared and the fact that I almost was like finding excuses not to do it.
Right.
Which is like such an embarrassing thing to say because it was amazing. But it was just kind of like, that's how I felt. I was almost like, I almost hoped I got COVID before, like just an excuse because I was so scared. I remember actually thinking that, like, I had to take a test a couple of days beforehand, and I was just like, part of me almost, and of course, like, had I actually had COVID and not been able to go and whatever, then like I would have looked back and would have been like, shit. But of course, I went and I was terrified, and I kind of came back and I was like, oh god, I'm so glad I did that because you have to, and I think you're spot on. That discomfort, that churning guts, bone deep terror. That means you're doing something right. You are spot on. I've never thought about it like that, but it's completely correct.
Well, even like, so Scaredy Boys, the other podcast I do, we did our first live show not too long ago. And I hope Sean doesn't mind me mentioning this. I'll maybe check with him before I release this. But before the show, he was obviously feeling a bit nervous. And he said, Damian, what are we doing? And I kind of just said to him, like, well, what's the benefit of not doing it, though?
Yeah.
There is no benefit to going, actually, you know what, we're not going to do it. We're just going to stay in be the big fish in the little pond. And same for that meeting that you had, same for the meeting that I had. I'm like, well, me not doing it, because I definitely feel the same thing. Maybe I just say no. Maybe I just go, look, never mind. And I'm like, but what's the benefit in not doing it? There isn't one, other than I stop feeling this brief moment of anxiety, But I know that's only temporary. And I know that, in fact, the adrenaline that comes after the meeting, even if it goes bad, just having it done sometimes feels like, And I always just think for these things, you're like, well, even if nothing comes of it, me having this nerve-wracking meeting is still a notch on my belt that I can be like, I once met with Amazon or whatever it was. That's fucking awesome. Like, that's so cool.
And that's the thing, is like when I walked out of this meeting I'm talking about, like, it was the same thing. Like, I went, and even like going into the meeting, I was like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Like, sweaty palms, like, I would have been like, sheen of sweat on my face. And then I just kind of went in there and I did it, and I walked out of it, and like, I kind of just like was like, did that just happen? And then like on a quieter note, I was like, did I just nail that? I think I nailed that. And I didn't, but like, I just kind of walked out of there just like absolutely buzzing, being like, if this goes nowhere, that just happened. That will always have just happened. And fuck, I'm glad I did that. You know?
That's it.
Oh man. And it's so funny because like, I literally think until you said that thing, I'd never thought about that before, about like, before how many of like the meetings or things that have changed my life, I felt absolutely terrified and kind of just looking for a way for it to not work out. But how devastated I would have been had that
had you sort of given in to that urge to sort of back away. All right, dude. Well, we better stop it there. But this has been such a nice chat, and hopefully useful for some of the listeners out there. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on and joining me.
Dude, thanks for having me on. It was great.
It's been great. All right. Well, if you'd like to see more of Gab's work, I strongly suggest you head over to his website, GabrielBergmoser.com. Not only can you find links to all his novels, but there's a bunch of awesome blogs on there as well, often full of good writing advice. Similarly, you can subscribe to his newsletter to keep up with all the exciting things he's doing, which you can do at GabrielBergmoser.substack.com, or you can find him on Twitter at GoBergmoser, and I'll also pop all these links into the show notes as well. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at middaypajamas, or feel free to send me an email at shorttales.podcast@gmail.com. Until next time, this has been Short Tales, and I've been Damian Robb.